Mia, so should Alex and I introduce ourselves then?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm Emily Bender. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Washington. I work in computational linguistics, and since late 2016, early 2017, I've been looking at the societal impacts of language technology. And since that time, language technology went from being something specifically about language to the kind of thing that people talked about as if it were AI. And so a lot of the work that I had been doing combating hype within my own field became something that had a much more broader significance. So that's sort of a very brief version of my story. How about you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm Alex Hanna. I'm Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute. We're a nonprofit research institute that focuses on uh, looking at the harms of AI, but also imagining new technological futures. I'm a sociologist by training. I do a lot of work that focuses on looking at the data that's used in AI training as well as the labor behind it. So yeah.
Yeah, and together we're working on a book about AI hype, um, which we are in the thick of right now. And we have a link at the end of the slide deck, but we also run a podcast called Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, which hopefully is familiar to at least some of you, and hopefully something that you'll enjoy if it's new to you.
That is an amazing name for a podcast, by the way.
Mhm.
Really enjoy that.
Um, there's some backstory there, but it turns on the fact that Alex at least understands that show very well, the
It's a
namesake show.
great show. Lots of making fun of stuff. Yeah.
Hmm.
Cool. Some product managers, product designers, chatter of clouds, sociology major in the chat. Nice.
Yeah, welcome. Wow, we've got someone joining us from Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. They said
Awesome.
that it's 3 a.m. there. Oh my gosh.
Wow. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Quite late over there.
Yeah, thank you.
It's actually the reverse.
Oh,
It's noon, which is amazing because all these events that are usually in US or EU time zones are typically at 3 a.m. in the morning where I am.
yeah. Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
well, I'm glad we're accessible.
Yeah, no kidding.
May says, unemployed software engineer kind of hate AI more than my peers. Um, Wonderful ambiguity there in that sentence.
Ooh, school of nursing. Someone from Tech Equity. Hey, cool. Welcome.
Yeah.
Lots of folks here. This is great.
Yeah, this is great. Okay, so while people continue to trickle in, Emily, Alex, you can probably get started on your presentation.
Sure, thank you. So this is a pretty brief presentation just to sort of set the scene. We're mostly here for your questions. Um, and I'm going to start and then hand it over to Alex. So one of the things I think is worth talking about from a linguist point of view is this question of like what happened when OpenAI released ChatGPT and all of a sudden the hype just kicked into a new gear. And it's not like we didn't have AI hype before that or technology being sold as AI. All that's really old, but something changed in November of 22. And a colleague of mine, Leon Drzezinski, points out that when we just had the text to image machines, so the image generators like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion or Midjourney, no one was talking about those as maybe sentient, right? But as soon as there was those language processing things, and ChatGPT was the first one that was super widely accessible, but we saw this already with the Lambda system at Google, people started saying, oh, but this might be actual intelligence. And there's this ridiculous paper out of Microsoft Research called Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence that refers to, I think, GPT-4. And what's going on there from a linguistic point of view is that because it's in language, it is fooling us in a way that the images don't. And the reason for that is when we understand language, we do that by imagining the point of view of the speaker. But a point of view is something that belongs in a mind. And so as we are interpreting the text that comes out of ChatGPT, we are imagining minds behind that text. And if we don't step back and discard those imagined minds, it is easy to become fooled into thinking they're much more than they are. Um, that makes them quite dangerous because they look like nearly their solutions to all sorts of problems. So that we're getting hype all over the place, people saying, oh, this can be your teacher, this can be your doctor, this can be your lawyer, this can be your psychotherapist, and on and on. This can write your TV shows for you, etc. And that's causing all kinds of problems. And at the same time, it's terrible engineering. So as our colleague, Dr. Tamit Gebru points out, they're being sold as everything machines. But you can't actually test how well a machine does at everything. So it becomes these untestable claims. So what is AI? AI is actually, it doesn't refer to a coherent set of technologies. It's a marketing term that's been applied to various different things over time. The current sets of technologies that are called AI now include at least these 6 different things. So we have automated decision systems, things, for example, that screen resumes, other kinds of classification, so face detection in images, which has both sort of awful surveillance applications, as well as more benign things like directing the autofocus on a digital camera. Recommender systems, so what's behind your Facebook or Netflix recommendations, are another thing that's called AI. There is the computer-like interface to human labor. So Amazon Go, these were the stores where supposedly it was all AI tracking what you took off the shelves so that you would get charged the right amount without having to interface with a cashier or checkout machine. Turns out it was actually being monitored by a bunch of low-paid workers in India. So not really AI. There's also stuff that's about format translation. So automatic subtitling, machine translation, that kind of stuff also gets called AI. And then finally, there's the synthetic media machines. So ChatGPT, DALL-E, and so on. If we call this all AI, what happens is the apparent success of one type. So, hey, automatic transcription got better. Oh, ooh, cool, DALL-E can make the picture I was asking for, makes the other ones seem more credible, even though they actually have nothing to do with each other. So I think it's better to talk in terms of automation, which then makes it easier to ask questions like what's being automated, who's automating it and why, who's benefiting from that automation and who's being harmed. Very concretely, what's the input and what's the output? Is that even a reasonable input-output mapping to be making? What was the training data? What was this based on? How well does the automation work in the use case that we're considering? Who's being harmed, worth saying again. And then who has accountability for the functioning of the automated system? Once we start talking about AI, it's also this great trick for displacing accountability. And then finally, if we're thinking in terms of regulation that we might be pushing for, what existing regulations already apply to the activities in question? How do we make sure those are actually applied in practice? And then what else is needed? On to you, Alex.
Yeah, so that's I love the pairing between Emily and I because Emily really goes and does this kind of linguistic oriented analysis of thinking about communication and communicative intent, and then kicks it over to me and I'm like political economy. And so then thinking more about what these things are. So I mean automation has historically been, this cudgel against workers as a way of finding ways to effectively say, well, we're going to effectively have a way to, supplant you with technology, whether that actually can actually work or not. And I mean, it's kind of a historical move. It's a common refrain. We've kind of seen this in many different guises, whether it's been, you know, this guy, Bryn Jolson and McAfee, who basically said, we're in a fourth industrial revolution, and actually, we're going to replace a bunch of workers, and actually, we're going to have to like completely do a bunch of reskilling of workers so that they can actually function in this new information economy. And so the kind of hype within work on the workplace has really come in lots of different shapes and sizes. There was a report that was put out by Goldman Sachs where they said that a fourth of a fourth of all work worldwide is going to be like, and not jobs, but work is going to go away due to automation of generative AI, where they've said 2/3 of work, 2/3 of all jobs are going to be exposed to some kind of automation. So it's been, these really, these very, very intense claims, and now they're really walking it back. And so in particular, we've seen certain unions take a very strong position against this. And I think in ways that they are seeing what the threat is and are rising to meet the moment. And so, two that I love to talk about is the WGA and National Nurses United. So the WGA, the Writers Guild, both East and West, if, of course, went on strike last year for 148 days. And initially the strike was focused on the payment and residuals from streaming services, which were especially low. But then, they also had the AMPTP also had this kind of thing around AI. And so basically they want to explore AI in the writer's room. And so writers made this a big point as well, and fought for protections in their contract, which basically said, you can't bring this stuff without writer consent, or, if it's given to us, you have to disclose that this was written by, an AI tool or is generated from an AI tool. National Nurses United has also done the same thing. I mean, I think also noticing that this AI is kind of used in these multiple registers that Emily's talking about. That it's not just these generative tools, but these tools like remote observation, kind of decision making in the back office, etc. All right, next slide. Um, and as Emily mentioned, these things are also a front for not so secretly low paid workers. So I think the most kind of visible fights we've seen with regards to ChatGPT have been on the human workers, typically in the majority world, who are doing the hard work of filtering through all the nonsense that these things are producing, but also sometimes actually taking over where these tools fail. So the person here pictured Richard as a content moderator in Kenya, and had been fired from Meta um, for doing organizing in his workplace, um, and for fighting for basically protections against the intense mental health load that was put upon him and his co-workers. So some reporting by Bill Paringo and Karen Howe talked to those workers. And there's a project out of DAIR called the Data Workers Inquiry, which we've been doing for the last few weeks, has highlighted these workers leading research projects precisely on the kind of labor conditions that they encounter. So there was one on in Richard and his colleagues in Kenya, most recently, I think last week, and this is on the DARE PeerTube site, which I can drop in the chat. There's also a panel about Latin American workers that was done in Spanish, talking about things from mental health to moderating and training models for abusive content from conflicts that they encounter themselves, to the types of ways in which they're kind of cowed into using company script to get paid. So like Amazon Mechanical Turk workers often get paid simply through Amazon Pay, and sometimes can't access that pay. But yeah, I'll drop the channel on that when I'm done talking. Next slide. And so we see that there's huge amount of VC that's going into it. I mean, in the past 2 years, it's basically been half of all venture capital investment going to AI. I mean, we saw it was 27.1 billion of all VC investment went into AI, and that was nearly half of it. But next slide. We kind of see that the investment isn't paying off. So I mentioned the Goldman Sachs, their initial um, very optimistic speculation last year about the exposure to automation. But we're seeing that's not paying off, both from people inside Goldman Sachs and also labor economists. So Darren Asamoglu, and I know I completely butchered that name because it's a Turkish name, and I know those letters don't actually sound like what they look like for me. But he basically said that AI is only going to increase productivity for 0.5% over the next decade. And then also there's Jim Covello, who's a higher up at Goldman Sachs, also is saying that it's nowhere where it needs to be in order to be useful for even such basic tasks. So we're kind of at the precipice here where the hype bubble is popping and we see this, but that is also, not that doesn't mean kind of we're past the current hype era and that we're going to see those kinds of threats to workers necessarily decline. Um, yeah, I'll leave it there and then we can talk about what's next.
Yeah, so we have some links for you on the end. If you're interested in more from us, we have links to our publications. I added one to my media appearances, and we run a podcast, Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, which is snarky and irreverent, and we have fun basically taking apart AI hype artifacts. And that podcast, you can currently find, I think, 39 or so episodes already posted.
39, yes.
Yeah. And we have a newsletter. And as some of you heard sort of before things started, we are hard at work on a book called The AI Con, which should be out in May of 2025 from Harper. So that's exciting. Please look out for it. Please pre-order it once that's a possibility. And we are really super eager for your questions. I'm gonna, I think, turn off the slides here, if that's okay.
No worries.
And yeah, all right. Let's do that, because that way, like, I can share links too.
Yeah, so chat if you want to put your questions in here for Alex and Emily to answer, or if you're more comfortable going off mute, you can also ask them directly.
Looking at all the great stuff happening in the chat.
Kia ora. Um, this is James. That was Te Reo Māori, the language of the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm deeply uncomfortable with radio silence. So, hi. Um,
Hi.
Sitting as I do in a privacy regulator. Before that, I was part of a civil society organization here. There's a couple of areas of questions. One is about personal information going into these systems. So there's the scraping of massive amounts of data that collects everything that's in, the reachable internet, and then puts it out in unpredictable ways that makes it hard to do the normal things you would do with information, like track whether information about you exists in a system. So flagging that as an area of interest. What's possible? How do people do governance and risk management around that? We obviously think that they should, or my employer would think that they should. Um, that's one thing I'll put a flag in, and the other thing is in organizations like the public service where you're doing governance-y things. You're trying to manage risk and document the state of play and have people document what people have signed off. And the prevailing vibe of these are everything machines that can summarize, that make information so much more useful, will be so helpful for all those functions. There's a like a real strong default of assuming that these systems work as intended in all those functions. That's another thing that I really want to put a flag in, as an area of question, concern, inquiry, where I think critical perspectives need much more amplification in an accessible way.
Yeah, thank you. Those are super important points. I guess I have a lot to say about the second one, so I'm going to jump in and then hope that Alex has stuff to say about privacy, though I have thoughts there too. Um, I have been, well, first I want to point to work by Anna Lauren Hoffman, who like very wonderfully goes after the AI is in its infancy metaphor, where it's like not only is it sort of presumed to work. Well, if it doesn't work now, well, that's just because it is still immature and it will get better. And so there's this like assumption that it's going to be better in the future. And so therefore we have to go with it. And then this whole pernicious thing about it's a baby we should be taking care of, which ew, right? Um, so that's sort of one direction. On the information access side of things, I have written some papers together with Chirag Shah about information access systems and why it is that having these sort of frictionless machines that just give you the answer to your question is a big problem, because you don't want the answer to your question. You might think you do, but in fact, if you are just fed the answer, you lose these opportunities to do sense making, to understand the landscape of information sources and how they relate to each other. And so that I think is a really super important area to be pushing towards. And it all sort of comes down to refusing to be impressed and like retaining the right to refuse. So when the tech companies say, this is magic, this is the thing that you want, and our tech does it, well, it's like, no, it's not magic. No, your tech isn't actually functioning as advertised. And no, I wouldn't even want that. And it's worth sort of articulating that. So those are my first thoughts there. And thank you very much for breaking the radio silence. Also gave people time to put some questions in the chat here.
Yeah. James, can you ask your first question again? Just restate it.
Sure thing. So, the particular concerns around personal information. So,
Mm-hmm.
there's this web scraping and other ways of getting a whole lot of information. That builds various training data sets that contains information, personal information about people. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the item of interest for the the responsibilities that my employer's here to uphold and enforce. Um, and there's some real challenges in terms of how do you how do you as an individual know if information about you is captured?
Yeah.
What's feasible in terms of investigating that, stopping the machines from saying things about you that might be accurate and
Yeah.
unhelpful, or inaccurate and unhelpful. So kind of end to end across the life cycle of these machines,
Yeah.
um, what's tractable in terms of that governance of personal information?
Yeah. That's a really, really good question. And I don't know what the privacy legislation is in Eritrea. But I mean I haven't necessarily seen anybody in the EU under GDPR come with kind of privacy challenges. But I mean, there would be possibly a plausible case under the kind of right to be forgotten within GDPR to say that you've collected some private data, and that private data, I should be able to opt out of that private data set because there's the risk of possible privacy kind of leakage that comes out of that. But I actually haven't seen any kind of claims that are being made on that front, or if there's any kind of loopholes that allows them to do that. But I mean, there's a compelling argument that could be made that there are no real privacy guarantees that you get from generative AI or large language models. The studies that have been done, and there's one researcher, Nicholas Carlini at Google, who has done a number of studies that basically shows many of these things are pretty readily regurgitatable. Um, if you insert kind of a partial amount of PII, that it can output these things rather readily. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd be curious, if there are kinds of claims under, the national legislation within your office to possibly bring, for individual data subjects to kind of bring similar claims against these companies.
Yeah. And I think just at sort of a general, like individual attitude level, it's worth pushing back on well, of course they have the right to our data. It's just there, they just took it, or you have to
Mhm.
give up your data in order to be able to participate in these things. Like it could be otherwise. It's not actually an inherent property of some of this technology, right? If you want a pedometer, if you want to track your steps, that does not require sending your data to Google. But right now, the world that we live in is, you can go get a really old school pedometer, but otherwise it's going to Google because Google owns Fitbit, yeah, or Apple or whoever. There are so many great questions happening in the chat.
Yeah, that's a great one. Now let's start up here. There's the tech workers is a provocative question. I can take this one because
Okay, go for it.
it's very funny. If we're seeing the AI hype uh bubble or AI hype not panning out in profit, why shouldn't we just trust the market will take care of it? Well, my friends, you are organizers, you know the market doesn't take care of it, the things alone. There needs to be, activism and movement against them as a ways to change the narrative and to also push back on that. I mean, I don't think that is, we cannot trust the market to do such a things. That's kind of the short answer to that. But I love the provocativeness.
Yeah. I want to jump to this question from Aria. What do you think
Yeah.
is the most accessible way to explain the variety of flaws with AI to people with a non-technological perspective? I've noticed some of my professors and peers treating it like a genuinely intelligent everything machine and want to share a different perspective, but I'm unsure how. So it's one of these things where like it's fun and exciting and it just seems so great. And if you're coming in with the flaws, you're coming in as the negative Nelly, right? Or Debbie Downer, right? But I think a lot of the flaws are actually really accessible. So the environmental impact is very clear at this point. The fact that ChatGPT and other things like that are built with incredibly exploitative labor practices. So you can ask these people, when you buy chocolate, do you try to avoid the brands that can't tell you for sure that they're not using slave labor and child slave labor to pick the beans? Well, that case is, if that's who you are, then why are you using ChatGPT? Like it is similarly bad. And there's this wonderful reporting by Karen Howe and Billy Perigo. And then you can go to the Data Workers Inquiry and, hear from some of the workers themselves about what this is like. And that's not, it's not a technical question, right? It's a economic labor lived experience question. I think in terms of the, popping the bubble about why it's wrong, it might be worth just asking questions like, why do you think ChatGPT has the answer to that? Okay, if it got it right in that case, what do you think, like, how did it get there? Like, ask them to drill down and ask them why they trust it, is a direction I would go.
This is kind of related to this one thread, which I think is worth double clicking on, which is by Fred Groves, who says, any ideas about getting AI hype consumers to actually hear any criticism? I make the case to people to their face and just they look right past me. And I think and there's some people that are saying like, one person said they used ChatGPT to organize information about their health, to use the right language to speak to doctors, software engineers that make kind of boilerplate. And I think it's, I think at the end of the, I kind of thinking about this, and this is kind of a series of questions we kind of go through in the book where we're sort of thinking about, okay, well, what is the sort of like, what are the sort of arguments that you can make with certain groups of people? And to some people, the labor argument isn't really strong. To some people, the environmental argument is very strong. They're just like, well, okay. And I think there's a few things that you can sort of go and approach these people with. So first off, I mean, the software engineers, there's evidence that, I mean, that ChatGPT generated code is effectively is probably going to be more dangerous code, that they're actually going to introduce security risks by introducing that work. And so, so that's one argument within that. And I mean that it's, there's a sort of potential devaluing of that, of the ability to actually find places where code is going to introduce security errors. I think there's also the aspect of it where, like you possibly have the ability of your skill or your skills getting a bit rusty, and having part of that. I mean, that might not be compelling to too many people, but it could be. Um, I think there's also an element of, I mean, the health stuff is pretty worrying for me, seeing that there was somebody using that, just because that might be a way in which there is going to be a way in which organizing that, trying to organize information with ChatGPT is then going to produce something that is wildly inaccurate for that person. I think there was an anecdote I remember seeing where someone was saying, I think someone tagged us in this, where they had run into a clinic or something, the um and the person had said, you need to give my husband an EpiPen or something, like, because
Sounds, yeah.
ChatGPT says that he's like having an anaphylactic reaction, and they're like, it could be many things. But they had gone in with that. I mean, that's also quite a big worry. But at the end of the day, it's, if there's sort of like this idea of kind of an impression, as Emily has said, like, people have kind of come from this and been very, very, very surprised or impressed, then sometimes they're going to kind of be sticky with that thought process. So I mean, I think it often involves taking a number of different angles of attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the things we see over and over again is that people identify real problems, right? I have a health concern and nobody can find the diagnosis, or my kid can't keep up in class and there's not any supports available for them, or all of these things where there's a real human need. And then someone has said, well, ChatGPT can do that. And so if you try to take it away and try to say, no, that's not a solution, then they hit you back with, well, but don't you care about mine? It's like, yes, I do care. And I don't want it to get worse because you're relying on, we've got a bunch of snarky, irreverent names for these things. So synthetic text extruding machine or mathy math, or there's others, and maybe that's not the moment for the snark, but basically you're relying on something that has no accountability, no communicative intent, no commitment to, there's no being in there with a commitment to what it's communicating, no understanding. Like, that is not something to put into one of these sensitive situations. But it's worth, I think, recognizing and honoring the hardship and pain that is in the situation that people are looking for a solution to, as we push back on this not being a solution for it. And systemically, oftentimes the solution is, widening the lens and looking at, okay, why have we shredded the social safety net? Why are we not providing each other what we owe each other here so that people end up stuck in this position? But at an individual level, I think that is sort of cold comfort, right? To say, yeah, I agree, you should have healthcare provided, isn't going to help the person who has the need. And so we have to sort of honor the need while also saying that's not actually going to help you. So Sin has one in here. AI is only as good as the data that goes into it. So the fact that the current exploitative data practices are seeing lawsuits, the CAA one, New York Times versus OpenAI, et cetera, is excellent and bringing a lot of much needed attention on our data ecosystem. How do we build more energy here? I'm also interested in resources on building more just and equitable data ownership systems. How do I get started there? So I've got a couple of thoughts, but I think, Alex, you might have even more on this one. But just to start, AI is only as good as the data that goes into it is not quite true. There are some systems that get sold as AI that are doing a reasonable sort of pattern matching over a data set. And if the use case is close enough to that training data, then yes, it will be as good as the data that goes into it. There are other cases where it is the output of the so-called AI system is much worse than the data that went into it. So if you look at Meta's Galactica, which they released right before ChatGPT and then took down, that was supposed to be this large language model for science, and you could ask it for a Wikipedia article or a scientific article on any topic. It's just making paper mache out of its training data, and it was supposed to be good because it was scientific literature. So there are many systems that are data-driven pattern matching systems where they are only as good as the data that goes in. There are many that are much worse. At the same time, the value such as it is, the people's ability to attract investment based on this, and in some cases maybe make money based on it, is very much driven by the data. So you're absolutely right there. And moving to an understanding of things where data ownership sits with the people whose data it is would be wonderful. Or sits with the communities that it belongs to. And here, actually, I want to point back to Aotearoa, New Zealand, and the wonderful work of Te Hiko Media, who have come up with a data stewardship idea around the Maori language that they have collected. So that's amazing. And it is very much situated in its community. So the folks at Te Hiko Media are not promoting that as a solution for everyone, but they're saying, here it is if you want to come look at what we did that made sense for us. And I think that's a good starting point. And I will look that up while I pass this back to Alex, that question or whatever else you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, like just plus one to that to Hiku Media. I mean, there's also this Federation of African NLP startups that DAIR has been working on standing up, particularly focused on thinking very critically about data stewardship. I want to sort of take the language that the data is only, the AI is only good as the data you feed into it, because I think that's often used to talk about bias. And just thinking about like the bias question in AI is maybe the least interesting one. And I say not because it's not because it's not a problem, like bias is a problem, but it's a one that sort of, is technically tractable to certain institutions. Um, and so for instance, Nora, I want to go to actually to Nora's question, because it's mainstream where I work to bring up concerns about standard responsible AI concerns like offensive output and copyright. But how do we get our responsible AI teams to talk about our use in AI tech for use Israeli military? And yeah, I mean, I think that's more about trying to understand what these things are effectively used for and provide some ideological cover for. It's lost, it's not just AI tools. It's about, if you're at Microsoft, the HoloLens that they had. Um, it's about cloud services that get leveraged. I mean, no tech for apartheid and no tech for genocide focus, not, I mean, I think the AI is it's an entry point about talking about this, but at the end of the day, I mean, thinking about data center access and Project Nimbus and kind of scaling is more about what data is. I mean, what you're enabling a certain kind of level of data access or data facilitation of a military force, right? And I mean, that has a lot to do, and that is less about bias. Oh yeah, there's a cat. This is Anna. Hello, Anna. Um, we're big cats. You can usually hear Emily's cats when they get on the mic.
Yeah, Euler's being polite and staying a little bit further over there, but she might come this way.
Yeah. Um, but it is thinking about where is it, like what is this kind of a stand-in for? And so I do want to, I do want to call that out. Um, I guess the other kinds of aspects of data governance is sort of like it has to do with kind of about how we think about data and how we kind of, I don't want to say respect data, but I mean that's kind of what it is, because data itself. I mean, we have all these. Speaking of Anna Lauren Hoffman, her and Luke Stark have this article called like "Data is the New What," and it's kind of about it's about the kind of metaphors we use for data and how they are kind of used and abused. Um, and and so I mean, this is kind of a thing, like what kind of object is data? Um, and I mean, I think after looking at data for so many years, I mean, one thing that I think is important to remember is that data is, and I'm thinking about this formulation a lot, but like data is labor in a lot of different ways. Like data has to change a lot of hands, whether that's kind of like your labor of being this person on the internet and you've had to like kind of input your data there, or if it's about data workers, or if it's about people who kind of safeguard and steward data. I mean, it should have this kind of care that goes into it. And I think the really promising things about looking at organizations like Teheku Media and also Lasan.ai, who's an organization that DARE works with, is that stewardship of data takes a lot more work. And it means it's also tied to the function of what the machine is. So if it's is this like everything machine, this like large language model that promises to do everything, data is a much different artifact than just saying this is a machine translation thing for like a few languages that are about respecting this community. And so data is tied to the usage in many important ways.
Yeah. And that for me ties into also the work on data set documentation that
Mhm.
I and others got into in the late 20 teens because if you are going to pick up a product and use it that is trained on some training data, then you really need to know what's in it. And if you don't know what's in it, then you can't use it safely, you can't use it appropriately. But also, talking about cultures of care around data, if you're going to properly document your data, then you've got to know what's there and then, be aware of the people who are represented, and all of these sort of questions follow, and it ends up being a different scale. And that's okay. Like some of the hype is, well, it has to be big because if it's not big, it doesn't work. To which I say, well, it doesn't actually work anyway. Like what is synthetic text extruding machine for? Like what's the purpose
Mhm.
of that? Um, and the sort of most solid use cases are things like, oh, well, it helps me code. Well, you don't actually need all of the data that's gone into ChatGPT to build something that helps you code. And you would actually rather prefer something that is trained on a smaller, more curated data set of code, honestly. So if there's some, and I'm sorry, I don't have the reference for this, but some folks in security looking into this, I think this is what's called an audit in the book, Alex. I think it's your reference, which is why I don't know it off the top of my head, but basically found that the more common coding idioms are what comes out of the machine because it's more common in the
Mhm.
training data and it's not necessarily the best and it's not necessarily the most secure. And there was a point early on anyway where um, ChatGPT, I think it was, or maybe it was Copilot, something was outputting non-existent Python libraries
I've
in this
already seen
code.
this.
And then someone went through and created a Python library by that name that was malicious code. So, like, it is not actually a security conscious choice to take the output of your code generating machine and say, yep, that looks good. And it's also like much, much harder to debug something that was generated that way than something that was, it's hard to spot your own bugs, true, but they are bugs that come about because of the way we as people think about computer code, as opposed to random stuff because the machine decided to spell the variable differently another time or whatever, and it landed on top of something else and so on.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good point. I think someone had mentioned this in the chat, and this kind of gets to Emily's point about like good like information access practices, like yeah, someone's like, well, you could still go to Stack Overflow and kind of look it up. And I'm like, well, Stack Overflow also has like a reputation system, and you can sort of double check it, and you can sort of see who's saying what. And I mean, I think Stack Overflow, and I don't know what the status of like Stack Overflow and these large language models are. Yeah, they did a
They,
big
they did the right thing
partnership.
for a little while, but I think they backed it
Yeah,
down
yeah,
eventually. Yeah.
they did a right thing, and then they did a big partnership. Yeah, so I mean so now it's just like kind of trash, right? But I mean, at some point they're like, well, you can't post AI generated answers. And then yeah, some people were trying to remove their answers. Yeah, I remember seeing that too. They're like,
Yeah.
and some people were doing that with the Reddit too. I mean, they were basically after Reddit did that big deal, Redditors were incredibly mad, and they um were trying to take down as many content, and they were kind of punishing them to like keep their content on. Oh
Yeah.
geez. Yeah, I mean it's a fucking mess. But I mean, yeah, I mean there's a purpose of having these kind of friction oriented information access systems so you actually can understand, there's some kind of human signal that you get into that, and you actually can get more into some of the, actual trust of some of these, like code elements. And shit, you might actually learn something if you read the justification of a long Stack Overflow instead of just copy pasta, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's wonderful. Alex, that's a great point. I'm wondering if you two could speak, a little bit about like the appeal of using ChatGPT to make things easier, right? To make things faster and kind of like break that apart a little bit.
Yeah, so I think, I'm sorry, I have to get back to the right window. I was just taking note of the Rick rolling um Rick rolling LLM,
Yeah.
which is hilarious
Yeah.
story, and I want to make sure it gets into our notes for our upcoming episode because
Yeah.
we need the comic relief from time to time. Um, I think that when uh whenever somebody says, "Oh, I'm using ChatGPT because it's easier," I think it's worth asking, what is the context? What is the context in which you feel like you need to do that the easy way? Is it that it is busy work and therefore does not deserve your time and attention? Is it that you are, you know, uh, overburdened and underpaid, and so you have to find shortcuts? Or is it the sort of place where you actually really would benefit from doing the work and doing the learning and you have time to do it? And I'm reminded of the recent New Yorker piece by Ted Chiang, where he talks about AI art and including fiction writing in that art and how it's never going to be art because the whole point is the choices that you're making. And he goes into this metaphor there, I think, a little bit of writing as nuisance versus writing as thinking, which Anna Rogers also talks about in a
That's
recent blog
great.
post.
Yeah.
And so from an education perspective, that's one of the things that Anna Rogers talks about is as educators, we create writing assignments because we want the students to do the thinking that that's going to provoke. And sometimes the students look at our assignments as writing as nuisance rather than writing as
Mhm.
thinking. But I think anytime someone says, I need this because I need it to help me, it's worth taking a step back and saying, well, why do you need that help? What are the set of circumstances that lead you in a position where you need that help?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with that. I mean, you're thinking about what are the incentive structures around, like doing things quickly. I mean, if it's, if you're compelled to do things, and I mean, there are some important questions about pedagogy in there, like students using this. And I mean, I think there was a poem going around the Twitters about like a student that used Chat GPT for a poem, and it's sort of, and the instructor was like, why like it's a poem. And I mean, and
Yeah.
I think it helps stepping back and saying like, well, why do students feel compelled to necessarily do this, and I think often it's because these things, come off as if they're a chore, and that's a very unfortunate thing. And I mean, I even had one of my roller derby teammates who teaches photography at a community college, and one of the questions was, why do you, like, why are you interested in photography? And the student had put it in Chat GPT, and it replied something like, as a language model, I don't have opinions about photography. Like, I can help, like, please ask you, which was really sad to see, like, but it's sort of like, so I mean, this kind of, to some degree, I mean, it does play into a particular sort of capitalist and sort of, like, I mean, I want to say to some degree like carceral logic of sort of saying like you have to do these things rather than sort of thinking about, you know, taking some time and actually engaging. But I mean, that's, unfortunately it plays into that kind of institutional arrangement rather than kind of makes us slow down and think a bit more.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's another thing going around Twitter about some instructor who had like a get to know you assignment where they asked the students to tell something about themselves so they knew who they were teaching, and apparently students used ChatGPT to do that assignment. And the instructor was like, "Why? Like this so defeats the point."
Hmm.
Um, and sort of this is a little bit off topic, but I frequently get people sharing synthetic text with me. Like I will be tagged all the time on social media where someone has asked ChatGPT or Claude something, and they'll tag me, and it's like, I have no interest in reading synthetic text. Like if you couldn't be bothered to write it, why should I spend any time reading it? It's
Hmm.
one of those things. So that's the much less kind answer, I think, than to say, okay, why do you feel the need for this? What's the root cause here, and what do we need to actually address?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really, like, I think just as a sociologist, my orientation is not that like technology is singularly causal of anything, or at least as a good like non-technological determinist, or like and so it's more like, okay, it's not that like Chat GPT is making students lazier. It's that, there are lots of incentives basically that make students, try to get assignments done as soon as possible, or try to code as quickly as possible. And, people have been cheating at, you know, programming assignments since I was in, taking computer science classes 20 years ago. It's not like they're going to stop doing that, but I mean, why are they doing such a thing? And, like, what's the incentive structure set up to do for them?
Yeah. So
Um,
not how do we stop this, but not how do we stop them, but what needs to change if people are feeling a need to do this.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Mia, did we do what you wanted us to do?
Yeah, yes, of course. No, you totally answered my question in a really thoughtful way. And it brings like more questions to the forefront, kind of like how even though AI's build is new, like is it really? Do you want to speak to how, how these technologies are branded as innovative and fresh and different, and maybe how they aren't so much and how we've seen this before?
Yeah, so maybe I'll speak a little bit to what's happened technologically, because I know Alex has some great stuff to say about the history of the notion of AI. So it certainly seems like there was a phase shift in November 2022 when ChatGPT hit the scene. Like there was something different going on. And I think the hype would have it that, now we're on the cusp of actual AI, the everything machine, the data from Star Trek, right? Not data, the source of AI, but data, the character.
Lieutenant Commander data.
Yes, thank you, Lieutenant Commander Data. Um, but in fact, this is actually just a small change in really old technology. So language models are a component of things like spell checkers. If you remember the old T9 input system for texting, where my old's at, right? So way back in the day on the cell phones, if you wanted to type a word, you had to like hit the key enough times to get the letter to come up. And then there was this change, something called T9, which incidentally was developed as a bit of software to help people with physical disabilities access things. It was actually some access technology, which is pretty cool. And the idea was you would just hit each key once, and then the software would figure out what those words could have been and then rank them by likelihood. And that likelihood was an extremely simple language model, because at the time you didn't have a whole lot of memory or processing power on device. And so it was just looking at what's called the unigram frequency. So how common are these words in the training corpus just individually? You can go the next step and say, okay, given one previous word, rank the words and so on. It's just that we didn't have enough memory on our cell phones at that point to do that. That's language modeling. It's also useful, like I think I said, in automatic transcription. So you've got these systems that take the audio and come up with a set of possible words it might have been. And then the language model re-ranks those as, okay, but what's actually the more likely thing, more common compared to the training corpus. Similarly, machine translation works the same way and so on. So all that is old, and it was getting better and better as both compute got cheaper, memory got lower, and there was a switch in the underlying statistical models from basically just counting things up in context to using what gets very misleadingly called a neural net. So there's these more sophisticated, let's say, statistical models that allow you to more finely model the distribution of the words in the training text. So the language models get better, you get better automatic transcription, you get better machine translation. And then what OpenAI in particular, but also Google started doing was saying, what if instead of using this thing to just re-rank the sentences, we ask it, what's the next word, what's the next word, what's the next word, and get it to spit out text. So with GPT-2, it was actually kind of coherent and sensible for the first time, where previously, if you guys remember the game where on your smartphone, if you type like, I'm sorry I late, I have to and then just pick the middle word in the suggested words over and over and over again, and you would get this like thing that seemed to reflect what you usually typed on your phone. Like that's
Yeah, the
effectively what ChatGPT is doing.
autocorrect, yeah, or like
Yeah,
auto predict or whatever. Yeah,
yeah.
complete this. Yeah.
Auto completion. Yeah.
Hmm.
So that's what ChatGPT is doing. And the difference between ChatGPT and what was on your old smartphone is way more training data. The slight underlying change that allows it to more finely model the distribution of words and text over larger context windows, and the secondary layer of training where they hired people in Kenya and elsewhere in the majority world to like poke at it over and over again and sort of rate the output. So it becomes more likely to output things that are going to get a high score from these raters. And also more training data that's conversational, because most of the training data available to that point was not conversational. So all of that is not any big change, but OpenAI gathers this training data, doesn't tell anybody what's in it, does all of the secondary training exploitatively, doesn't tell people about that, and then wraps it up in this web demo. And that's the thing that was sort of this big surprise to everybody who wasn't already working in this space. So it's not this like earth-shatteringly new technology, but understandably, it felt very new if you weren't involved in all the preceding stuff and you didn't know the connection between that and the predictive text on your phone. But the history of AI, totally not new.
Yeah, I mean, I love this because Emily really covered the kind of particular history of language technology, and but the history of AI goes back, quite a long way. I mean, even saying the 40s and the 50s, and I mean, I think we're about at time. So basically, long story short, lots of stuff has been called AI throughout the years. And and that has been anything from programming languages to kind of like ways of distinguishing between different sorts of things for military applications. So I mean, and it's not until, I mean, this idea of neural networks is quite an old idea that was first formulated in the 40s, that has just kind of, was then became this very productive point of research. That's all I'll say. It's very abbreviated.
Yeah. You said almost at time, but actually, what's the time frame here
Oh
now?
yeah, when are we?
Well, we're technically at the hour, but I'm happy to stay on a few extra minutes if everyone else is happy to, ask some more questions, or if we want to start a petition to get you guys on Oprah. Yeah, whatever, whatever the chat feels like.
What do you say,
Uh,
chat?
I gotta head out. Yeah, there's some great resources on CBAs in the workplace on automation. That's DAIR is also working on something of that. Um, Oprah, I think we've had a lot of people hit up Oprah. Like,
Yeah. That's that show is such a disaster. Like, although, we also in a lot of the commentary there, it's like, yeah, Oprah also gave us Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil. So,
Mm.
not surprising that she's platforming the worst voices on this. But
Well, she is a billionaire for a reason, I think. But
really.
the last question before you go, Alex, Emily, what is the most important message you want everyone to take away tonight?
you have the right to refuse, I think. That is, you can refuse the premises of what people are saying. You can refuse to share your data. You can refuse to use this stuff. And it's important to keep exercising that right.
Yeah, and I would think my would be, like collective action gets the goods, like anything. And I mean, I think that the strongest AI governance tool that we have at our disposal have been our unions. And so, yeah, keep organizing and keep on working. I'm glad to see that there's many working groups within DSA and within TWC as well. So keep doing that.
Yeah, keep it up.
All right, that was amazing. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Alex, for joining us tonight. Thank you, everyone who came. And please don't forget this is a three-part series happening next week as well. Same time, same day, same link. I will see everyone there. And good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank
Bye.
you. Good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.